Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Institute for Government webinar. We're going to be looking today at how Keir Starmer's government has started and what we can tell about how they plan to approach governing. We're not even a week into the lifetime of this Labour government, but a lot has happened already. We've had a lot of ministerial appointments. We've had a meeting with the mayors. We've had a big speech by Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, which set out some of her early priorities. And we've had a big ministerial press conference in which Keir Starmer declared his mandate to do politics differently through mission delivery. So what does this all tell us about how Keir Starmer plans to govern? What does Labour's mission-led approach mean for the way that government is going to operate? How will central government relate to locally elected mayors? And what do Keir Starmer's cabinet appointments reveal about his future government? Lots to discuss over the next hour, so do please start sending in your questions via Slido, and I will take those throughout the session today. It's a great webinar lineup you have before you today to answer all those questions. We've got IFG Deputy Director Emma Norris, IFG Director of Impact, Joe Owen, and I'm really delighted that we're joined by Jen Williams, who's the Northern correspondent at the Financial Times. So hello, everybody, and hello to everyone who's joining us today. Joe, I'm going to kick off with you. As I was saying, we've had sort of a frenzy of activity since the government was elected last Thursday. Lots of press releases, some speeches already, quite a lot of little social media videos and things like that. What has stood out for you so far?
Cool. Good question. For me, at least, what has stood out, and I mean this in a good way, is the lack of drama or surprises. I think we've been used to, in recent years at least, the sort of, with the arrival of new prime ministers, some high drama around cabinet appointments, for example, new prime ministers using their moment of power to make big changes to their top team, sometimes settling scores by dumping people to the backbenches or demoting them, and then endless speculation about what that means about which wing of the party is up or down in the new administration. And this time, Starmer appointed his full shadow cabinet to their jobs, except in two instances, one of which where he had to fill a slot as a result of Thangam Debonair losing her seat. And the biggest surprises on appointments so far, at least, has been the appointment of some expert Lords ministers, which isn't necessarily what you would call high drama necessarily. The other area where we might have seen some surprises is in the policy space. There was speculation about what Reeves might include in her speech on Monday, for example, drawing parallels to Gordon Brown's Bank of England moment in '97, maybe. But actually, you say we've seen a flurry of announcements, but a lot of them have been based entirely around the things they just said they would do when they got in: planning, junior doctors, negotiations, teachers recruitment, small boats command, commitment to Ukraine. It's obviously very early days, but it's clearly quite a deliberate statement. They want to demonstrate that they are doing the stability that they promised they would in opposition, and they're focusing on delivering the things that they committed to, not pulling rabbits out of the hat, at least so far.
Emma, what's been notable for you?
I think, like Joe, definitely the appointments. On the one hand, you've got, as Joe says, this stability. Essentially, it's a kind of straight lift and shift from opposition into cabinet. But on the other hand, you've got them doing things quite differently. Of course, we've seen, kind of experts come in via the Lords before. Aradazi did it back in the noughties. So we've seen it before, but the kind of scale's pretty unusual this time. And just as interesting, I think, is what happened last night at the kind of tail end of some of the most junior ministerial appointments, where we saw 5 new MPs that have just been elected, go straight into parliamentary Under-Secretary of State roles. So people like Kirsty McNeil going into the Scotland office, or Miatta Van Buller as an energy minister in Desnes. And, even though they're new to being an MP, in some ways it's, again, a kind of focus on ensuring that people's expertise and backgrounds kind of match the offices. Miatta Van Buller has worked on energy for a long time. She was, the chief executive of NEF before. She's worked with Ed Miliband before. It makes total sense. Georgia Gould in Cabinet Office. She came from Camden Council, where she was the leader, and they're one of the local authorities who's been operating a kind of mission-driven approach to local government for some time. And so I expect that she'll be taking that expertise into Cabinet Office and their work on missions. So some quite new, interesting things, but all focused around the idea of stability of expertise and experience, and really bringing the kind of talent that the team has to government.
How about you, Jen? What have you found particularly notable?
Well, I mean, I've been watching to see what happens with this kind of growing army of English regional mayors. And, you know, one of the first things that Keir Starmer did was have them all into Downing Street, which certainly outwardly is a signal that he's taking that entire new sort of devolved landscape, which wasn't there before last time Labour were in government, that he's taking it seriously. I think on a kind of personal human level, it also frankly makes them feel important, and everybody likes to feel important. And there will be tensions doubtless further down the line, because there always is between different tiers of government, especially one that is as new as the English metro mayors. So that stood out to me, and also the fact that not only were they had in, not only was Keir Starmer basically saying, I'm taking you seriously, I want to hear from you, you are kind of an important part of this Labour administration, but also that the framing of that and the comms around it was all around them being part of his growth mission, which is something that they had been very keen on ahead of the election. They have all been very keen, or certainly the Labour ones have all been very keen to be seen as being able to deliver part of that mission on behalf of central government. And I'm sure we'll probably come back to the mayors, but I think that probably what the kind of delicacy of that is who actually has the true power to shape what that looks like, and the extent to which that ends up looking like a kind of power sharing arrangement, essentially, where if you are a mayor, you have a degree of purchase over what that should look like in your area, and you feel that you have been able to design it. And that could come into conflict with the fact that, you know, the Labour government has just been elected in large part off the back of promises to stabilise the economy and grow the economy, and therefore it is its central mission. And therefore you would have thought that the Treasury and Number 10 would want to have quite a lot of purchase on what that's going to look like on the ground. So I think that the early signals, the early outward signals on all of that in terms of a kind of the relationships there are all very positive, and about as positive as you could expect them to be, because it was within sort of 4 or 5 days that he had them in. But I think the real test for that relationship and where the mayors fit into that picture is going to still be to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been really conscious of noticing these changes in approach, or signalling things and thinking, aha, but you know, the proof is going to be in the pudding. But they have had less than a week, so there's not much time for there have been too much pudding yet. We've got lots of questions coming in online about missions. Just if you are putting in a question, do have a look and see if there's one that's quite close to what you might have asked there already. And if you like a question that's there, do feel free to uprate it so they come to the top of my screen, and then those can be the ones I ask. Emma, I was going to turn to you about this, the sort of overarching steer we're starting to get on missions. They were obviously a big feature of Labour's manifesto. Victoria is asking, how do you think a missions-led government approach will affect the civil service? Do you think that having missions is going to affect any lead to any sort of major machinery of government changes or changes at the centre? What have we heard so far?
Sure. So, I mean, look, I think the kind of first test, if you like, for the new government on missions was how much did it feel part of the kind of first speeches of the way that they were approaching talking about government, because it had obviously featured incredibly heavily in opposition. And that test's clearly been met. I mean, the very first speech that Starmer made outside Downing Street was focused on missions. Pretty much everything that has come out the mouth of a Secretary of State since then has been about the mission. So this clearly is the absolute core of their approach to governing. Now, that's not just important, I suppose, to reassure the public that they're serious about it, but it provides some really clear guidance to central government and beyond about what Labour's priorities are in government. And they are restating, like, these 5 things, this is at the core of what we're trying to achieve. And I think one of the things we've learned in the early days is if you look across the missions, they clearly see growth as the kind of key mission that drives and connects some of the others, and that's come out in some of the things that have been said. I think we've heard a bit more about structures in the last few days. Starmer set out in his first press conference that there are going to be 5 mission boards. I think whether or not that's a kind of change to government machinery, or really that's just a new way of describing cabinet committees, is a bit unclear at the moment. Starmer said that he's going to chair them himself, which would probably indicate that they're going to be cabinet committees. But I think there's a question about whether we'll see a kind of broader range of actors involved in those than you would normally see. Is there going to be space for non-Whitehall voices to be round the table in those mission boards? And if not, are other structures being created to make sure that, for instance, metro mayors, local authorities, industry, leaders in civil society, all the groups and sectors that Labour is very clearly going to need to work with to build missions, how are their voices being built into the early stages? We've probably information on what this feels like for departments and what the relationship between centre and departments is going to look like. But we got the start of an insight last night when it was announced that Chris Stark, who used to be the chief executive of the CCC and was chief exec of the Carbon Trust, is joining DESNZ to head up mission control, as it was described, for the Clean Power mission. Clearly a great appointment, yet another real investment in very deep expertise in net zero. I don't think we know much about what is meant by mission control yet. What does that look like? Is it some kind of structural change? And is that something that's going to be replicated for the other missions? Actually, the missions are all quite different. And the Clean Power one has a clear goal that you can imagine building a kind of vaccine task force style body around. Some of the others aren't quite as tangible yet. Opportunity mission has some, quite specific first steps underneath it, but there's probably a bit more development to do there. So you could imagine that actually machinery changes might look different for different missions. I guess if there's, just answering the question that was asked by the audience member, if there's one thing that's going to feel a bit different for government about missions, I think it's probably going to be working across boundaries. I think Labour really couldn't have been clearer that they see these as goals that the whole of government needs to be focused on. And I think they will be thinking about, not just in terms of machinery, but the kind of culture they're setting, what they're rewarding, how much emphasis they're putting on working beyond Whitehall. They're really expecting to see people kind of break out their silos. And I think that will be the kind of the big shift. The test is how easy is it to do that, because there have been successful and less successful attempts to do that before.
Thanks, Emma. And Jay, just sticking with the question of missions for the time being. I mean, as Emma says, there have been successful and less successful attempts to work across government, and often the lack of success comes down to how the money works. So what do we know about where the money for missions is going to come from?
Don't think we know loads yet. There was some specific of the sort of first steps that were funded by specific tax rises that Labour committed to in the manifesto, but clearly one of the big themes during the campaign was where does the money come from in order to pay for improvements to the health service, to fund the sort of clean energy mission. And this links back to the importance of the growth mission, where I think Labour's answer has been, we're going to get the economy growing and that will increase tax receipts and that will give us more money to pay for investment in some of the areas that we want to focus on. Now, you could step back and say that's plausible, that's true over the course of a parliament or so, but there's a real tight question about where the money goes on missions in the immediate term. And that is linked to quite a specific question about how they set budgets for next year, which currently they will need to do before November. And so they're going to have to run some form of spending review between now and the autumn. It's not clear whether that will be a one-year spending review where they sort of largely roll over and sprinkle in some spending on some of their top priorities and leave a big comprehensive spending review till next year. Or they could try and do something more comprehensive between now and the autumn, but the time is really quite tight in order to do that. But we haven't seen exactly what the plan is yet. We might see a little bit more in the coming weeks, as Reeves committed on Monday, to updating Parliament on the state of the inheritance in public spending, I think was the word she used. It's not entirely clear what that means. There are different ways. Some people are interpreting that as the moment in which she goes, we've just looked at the books and oh my God, it's so much worse, and tries to maneuver on some of the commitments they'd made about taxes. I think that is clearly just speculation, but that will be the first point, I think, where we see what they see as the problem in the state of the public finances. And at that point, they will need to say something about how they're planning to run a spending review to set budgets for next year. In order to be able to do that comprehensively for missions, I think it goes to Emma's point. We probably, or Whitehall will probably want a little bit more definition about exactly what they want to prioritise, at least in the short term or the medium term, in some of those missions. Opportunity was the example that Emma used. And it will be interesting to see if we get more of that definition on missions over the coming weeks, or whether they choose to give themselves a little bit of space to properly define the problem before they start setting themselves some targets.
Thanks, Shay. Jen, so that's quite a lot about what missions might look like in terms of sort of apparatus and money and so on. But how do you think, if at all, they are designed to impinge on the lives of real people? Do you think that is part of the concept of missions?
The missions always seemed like a little bit of a strange mixture of things to me, that they seemed kind of like really big picture over, some of them are really big picture overarching structural things like growing the economy, and other ones felt a little bit more retail. So, you know, to the extent that some of them are a little bit more retail, then I guess, yes, they are going to be about affecting people's lives on the ground. They also provide a template, don't they, for the next election, to be able to kind of go out with your list of things that you have, hopefully you can demonstrate some kind of movement on that people will feel is tangible on the ground. You know, does the NHS feel better, and so on. So I think, you know, I think there was an argument to say that they can be translated into something that is meaningful for people on the ground. But I think in the first instance, they feel to me more like a tool for the rewiring of government, for the focusing of priorities within government in order to deliver. And I think, to come back to the mayors, I think because, you know, there is a question, for example, we touched before on who's going to be on the mission boards. And I think I've seen that the idea is that these boards do have external voices on them. I don't know whether that is necessarily set in stone, but do you have devolved leaders on them? You know, do you end up with a mayor, or more than one mayor, or a first minister on the growth mission board, for example? That's kind of one question. But secondly, I think if you're talking about having these missions that cut across departments, I think if you are a regional leader, there's a degree to which that makes a lot more sense, because if you are looking at your area essentially holistically, particularly where the economy is concerned, you are not looking at these different policy areas in isolation. You're not looking at skills in isolation from transport, in isolation from housing. You are, by default, you are looking at them in the round, because you are saying, these are levers that I want to pull, because collectively they are going to move the economy of my area forward, and they're going to increase the well-being of the people living there. So actually, if you were a mayor, there's probably something that's quite logical about those missions, and they might be hoping that you know, in so doing, if you really do end up with agendas that cut across government departments, I mean, the one that has always struck me that never happened under the last government, which should have done, was health inequality, which really should have been driven as a cross Whitehall agenda, because it doesn't just sit in the Department of Health and Social Care. So if you take those missions as being something that do then cut across departments, and you are then trying to apply that to a place, then actually that could be something that works theoretically fairly well. I was talking to a mayor last week who was saying that, you know, it would be wonderful to think that this brings to an end the situation where in fact, it's actually more than one mayor that has said this to me, brings an end to the situation where there are some departments that are easier to work with than others. And then there are the departments that are difficult to work with. So then you kind of have to come up with a workaround, and you have to find somebody in that department who might talk to you because you happen to know them. And then after you've done all of that, you still have to end up talking to the Treasury. So the idea that you've got something that works on a kind of through a different lens might be quite welcomed in those places. But as I said before, I have a lot of unanswered questions, as I'm sure everybody on the call does, and there are a lot of tests. There will be a lot of tests, I think, of this, which hopefully kind of partially answers your question. I think if it works, you should be able to demonstrate something to people on the ground. Essentially is what I'm saying.
Emma, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, just a couple of points. Just on Jen's point on health inequalities, I couldn't agree more. And I think actually, when Joe was talking about the kind of next level of definition, what do missions look like beneath the headline goal, that's actually a real opportunity to build in some of that kind of cross-cuttingness and working across issues a bit more. Because at the moment, in some ways, the missions they could just sit within single departments. You've got your clean energy, it could sit pretty cleanly within DESNES. You've got growth, treasury, you've got, NHS, that's going to sit within health. But actually, if you take the NHS mission, if beneath that you said we want to focus on tackling health inequalities or, kind of making the nation fitter, suddenly actually you can see that drawing in lots more departments in a much more meaningful way. So I think actually that kind of next level down is a real opportunity to kind of embed people working, beyond government and within government in more innovative ways. I just also wanted to pick up this point on what difference will missions make to people's lives. And I think this is a really kind of interesting challenge for missions, actually, because on the one hand, they're clearly long-term kind of goals that are intended to reform the way that we think about government and the role of the state in a kind of modern world. On the other hand, Labour have a mandate to change people's lives now. They're coming in on the back of, a huge crisis in living standards, a huge crisis in people's ability to access basic public services. And everything we know about what the polling says is that people expect change on some of those things quite quickly. They want to be able to access health services more easily, get an appointment with their GP more easily. They want to feel that things are becoming more affordable quite quickly. And I think you can kind of see that playing out already, where on the one hand, you've got these long-term goals being emphasised again and again. On the other hand, you've got a government which really is clearly trying to show they are getting on with things and making changes immediately. Ed Miliband cancelling the offshore wind ban in the first 72 hours, housing targets reintroduced. You can see them trying as quickly as possible to say, yes, there's a big goal, but we're going to also be changing things that are going to have a material impact on people's lives straight away. And I think that kind of balance between immediacy and long-termism is something that's going to be a real kind of hallmark of how missions play out in practice.
That's really interesting. Jen, just to stick with this, the question of mayors and the whole no longer levelling up agenda for a little bit. What do you think this government ought to learn from what the last government was trying to do in terms of levelling up? Did that approach, did that kind of agenda set by Boris Johnson obviously originally make a difference to the way government operated and the success it had in trying to deliver those objectives? Or is there a different, should the government sort of just try something fresh?
Well, I think the difficulty about levelling up was that it was a kind of weirdly effective political slogan in that it could be interpreted however you wanted. And that was what made it completely impossible to deliver as a policy. Because what was it? I think there were kind of some foundations laid in the levelling up white paper that could be held on to. Actually, there was some smart brains involved in putting that together. And it will be interesting to see whether or not, I don't know exactly how Labour is planning on rolling out further devolution, for example, because if you come back to one of the things that they have confirmed about all of this, that they're going to have this Council of the Regions and Nations, well, great, but mayors currently only cover a little under half of the English population. So, who else is going to be on that forum, or are you expecting to kind of roll out more mayors at pace? And if you're going to roll out more mayors at pace, then what's the framework going to be for that? So do you continue to use the framework that exists in the Levelling Up white paper? Or do you do something different? So I don't think that there is nothing that can be taken from the previous Levelling Up agenda, but I think it is fair to say that there's not much that you can point to that is tangible evidence of delivery. I think the one thing that you could say about it, and I think probably the Northern Powerhouse is a better example of this because it was being driven by George Osborne. It is an example of something which was supposed to be cross-cutting. It didn't really happen, actually. And to come back to health inequalities, it was very obvious from the white paper to me that the Department of Health and Social Care seemed to have completely checked out from that entire process. So, there were anything that had been drawn up within the Michael Gove's department itself seemed to stand a bit more chance of actually getting delivered. But once you were talking about things that cut across the whole of Whitehall, it started to then look a little bit vaguer. And then kind of sort of disappeared by the wayside. But actually there is a parallel there with these missions, right? You're coming up with kind of specific missions that are supposed to cut across the whole of Whitehall. And I think one of the lessons that came from both the Northern Powerhouse and Levelling Up, and probably kind of other attempts to do this prior to that, is that you need somebody with the will and the authority within Whitehall, possibly more than one person, but definitely someone, to drive that. And Osborne did that with the beginnings of the Northern Powerhouse. Osborne went away, it fell away. I am not sure that Gove was able to do that with Levelling Up as a kind of cross-cutting policy goal. So one of the things that jumped out at me about those mission boards is that they are all going to be chaired by the Prime Minister, which makes it sound as though this is an agenda which is going to be led from number 10, and with that flows authority, right? So in a weird way, I think that you can take from the mistakes of Levelling Up and actually kind of take away some quite positive stuff. I think we can probably all agree that the competitive bidding situation during that period didn't go fantastically well. And I think Labour have made a lot of noises about doing away with that, although, we'll see whether they completely do away with it, but certainly to the extent and scale that it was used in the early days of the last government. I think the final thing I would say that was not really addressed at all during that Levelling Up period, and at the moment is not being addressed by Labour, and that is local government finance. And I think it is much easier to have a meeting of a dozen figureheads in Downing Street, where you put out a press release, they take a selfie of themselves on the steps and they talk about how important the regions are to them. That's much easier than dealing with the kind of underlying corroded wiring of government outside of Westminster, which is, it hasn't just been through a year of cutbacks, it has been through a sustained decade and a half of austerity, effectively, which means that it doesn't have the capacity that it needs to be able to get cracking on some of the stuff that we are talking about. And I am not yet clear, other than some stuff which is not unhelpful, like 3-year funding settlements for local authorities, reinstating some kind of deprivation equalisation kind of measure. That's all good, but it probably isn't going to answer the kind of the fundamental massive financial black hole that you have within that landscape. So I guess that's something else that you can take from the Levelling Up era, that they didn't deal with it, and will Labour.
Thanks, Jen. Joe, just before we move on from mayors, a more sort of political question, and one which is coming from Rachel Gregory from WPI Economics. She's asking, how pro-devolution is this Labour government? Will we see more, or are they just making the most of the existing framework, or appearing so pro-mayor because most of them are Labour mayors? What difference does the Labour affiliation of all except one Glenn Houchin make to this agenda?
Okay, good question. Before, I'm going to abuse my privilege and just say one more thing about Levelling Up and missions, which is, there's another lesson of Levelling Up, which is the longer you leave something undefined, the more it becomes this bucket that everyone pours their hopes and dreams into, that it's going to solve their specific issue. And the easier it is for ministers in response to difficult questions about problems to say, well, of course, our mission is going to fix this thing. And you can end up with this thing that becomes big and unruly, and actually something that was originally about prioritization has actually just become a Christmas tree that you hang everything you were already going to be asked to do off. And that is one of the reasons why I think early definition will help to avoid falling into the levelling up trap. So does it make a difference? The mayors are mostly Labour. I think it does make a difference. I think it makes the politics of greater devolution, which, as Jen said, Labour have said they're very committed to, easier. There are 2 points, though, just worth making on it. The first is it was the Conservative government that really drove the devolution agenda with respect to mayors. And they did that despite the majority of mayors, I think, at pretty much every moment being Labour. So I don't think it would be fair to say that the politics of the mayors versus central government has been this massive blocker on progress to devolution to mayors. And the second is in the interest of both mayors and central government to work together. Again, as Jen said, the importance of this agenda to the growth mission will mean they will both want to put party politics aside. The mayors who want to demonstrate progress in their local area, and central government who will see mayors as one of the key engines for growth. And you've already seen that in some of the comments from Starmer and from Ben Houchen. But as I said, despite those 2 points, I still think it will make a difference that the majority of mayors are Labour, and it will inevitably improve trust and support closer working when they get to some of the difficult conversations that they will need to. But it could make a difference in a less helpful way. I'm sure some Labour mayors found it very helpful to just blame things on the Tory government when things were difficult for them in their local area. And that's not going to be possible now. And we might see some of them, a bit like Andy Street had to at party conference for the Conservatives last year when HS2 being scrapped was running around rumours wise. They're going to have to make some difficult choices between party allegiance and local politics. So it's not going to be plain sailing. I don't think it means we're going to have this beautiful, joyous set of relationships that last indefinitely. But I do think on balance, on the whole, it will make things easier.
Jen, did you want to come in?
I was just going to add, there's a kind of slight distinction as well between the Labour mayors that have been kind of around since the start or shortly afterwards, who have been, you know, people like Andy Burnham, Steve Rotherham, Tracy Brabin, who've sort of been going out there alone as Labour figureheads when the Conservatives have been in government in Westminster. And the generation that has just come through now ahead of a Labour victory. And it feels to me as though there might possibly be a bit of a distinction in the extent to which they are willing to criticise the centre and rock the boat. Now, I could be completely wrong about that, and much of this stuff kind of just depends on personalities. Right, some are more willing to go out on a limb and say, no, not having it, I'm going to have a go at you, or, you know, some, dare I say it, might have ambitions of their own. But I think that to come back to the point about that delicate, there's a delicacy to the politics of what you are trying to do here, because you are trying, as you just said, you're trying to get to a win-win situation where the mayors are coming up with something that they feel they own, that is right for their area, but at the same time that dovetails with central government and central government's missions, and so therefore they walk away happy. So, how do you end up with, how does the process of drawing up a national industrial strategy fit with the process of drawing up separate growth plans for Greater Manchester, the West Midlands, London, South Yorkshire, et cetera, et cetera? I think that's going to be quite delicate, and I think that's going to test relationships internally. And inevitably, as a journalist, I'm going to be kind of watching out for the signs of that in public. So actually, at the moment, you have this one big kind of happy Labour family. We will see how that goes. Secondly, obviously, that won't always necessarily be the case forever. We're in an unusual position at the moment in that we only have one Tory in that landscape, and that landscape itself may get bigger, right? We might end up with even more mayors around the table in the near future.
Emma, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just another kind of related area that I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the relationship between central government and mayors unfolds is on planning specifically. Obviously, kind of Reeves has been super clear about getting on with reforming planning. it's an area that we've seen government after government promise that it's going to make changes and then be felled by backbench opposition. I do think that Labour probably has a chance to make progress in more favourable conditions than predecessors. Like, partly that's because of the mandate. Planning reform is a massive pillar of the growth mission, and so they've got a majority on the basis of the platform they've stood on. But I also think that relationship with Metro mayors is going to be absolutely critical. Done right, housing could be something that mayors really want if it comes alongside, if it's part of a kind of broader economic strategy to grow an area. If that relationship is meaningful back and forth between mayors and central government, then you can actually see some mayors being quite pro grabbing hold of that. In fact, I think Burnham's already said he's very pro Manchester taking a good chunk of new housing. So I think that relationship between this kind of generation of metro mayors and central government is part of the picture of making real progress at last on planning reform and actually building new houses.
And Joe, just picking that up and widening it out a bit, we've got a question from Graham, who's asking or saying a lot of Labour seats were won with very small majorities. Many will be in NIMBY areas. Do you think Keir will have enough time to get building and sell this to those areas before the next election?
Good question. I think how they manage the politics of their majority as a whole will be really interesting, because there might be some areas that they would see as the sorts of areas they would want to hold on to long term, come what may, in which it starts to shape their opinion more of how they manage the politics. There might be some where they say, we realised the politics of the last election was weird, and actually in order to shore up support elsewhere, we're going to need to accept that there are some places we're less likely to hold on to. And I think where we start to see whether or not they try and keep the whole coalition together and accept that limits their ability to deliver in certain areas, or whether they say the most important thing is just getting over the line with a majority at the next election. And in order to do that, we think we're best served by almost accepting there are some parts of the country that we're going to, or some constituencies and some concerns that we are not going to kind of have as a drag anchor on some of the commitments that we really want to make progress on. So it will be really interesting to see how they make that political balance over the next sort of year or so. And we will start to see it, I'm sure, in where they go next on things like planning.
Very interesting. Okay, let's talk a bit about what we might see next and move on to the King's Speech, which will be on the 17th of July. Joe, do we have any clear idea of what is likely to be in the first King's Speech?
I think we do. I mean, I think we will, obviously it's going to be the legislation that they want to bring forward in the next parliamentary session, and we'll see some of their early priorities as a result. I think we've got a sense of all of that in, well, not all of it, but some of it in the manifesto at least. So there's the fiscal responsibility lock bill, which requires OBR forecasts for major spending commitments. That might be one, actually a bill that we see in the Commons before recess. It's one of the ones they could potentially bring forward quite quickly. But I'd expect that to be in the King's Speech. Devolution, we've obviously talked about, and the so-called Take Back Control bill. I'm not sure those precise words will leave King Charles's lips, but you never know. Something on GB energy, something on workers' rights. We've got accustomed to King's speeches, including bills on immigration. We might see another of those. We could see something on Lords reform potentially, or some of the smaller reforms that they can crack on with, or some of the bills the Tories didn't take through during wash-up, but Labour supported. For us, at least, I think one of the things we're going to want to see is whether they take the opportunity to make the King's speech a bit more than a sort of narrative list of legislation. It's actually quite a big chance for Starmer, around the moment of the King's Speech at least, to set out a kind of translation of the manifesto into a clear set of priorities for government. And we at the IFG have argued that in various places, not least because of the importance it would have in driving activity around spending, running into the first spending review. So we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. But I think there are signs of some of the bits of legislation. And of course, added to that, there'll be all of the boring things that the civil service just needs legislation on for whatever reason, and you'll get 2 or 3 bills that might make people squint at and think, why the hell are they doing this? And it is probably because they just have to do some legislation on things to keep them running.
Yeah, and what do you think the likelihood is of some of the bills that were lost that the Conservative Party were trying to get through being picked up again? For example, the smoking ban bill. Do you think Labour will want to pick those up again?
So I think they will, and I think they've said that they will on things like smoking. There's renters as well, isn't there? There's football regulation, I think, to kind of those, I guess, as some of those they could just not make a big deal out of in the King's speech, but just decide to bring forward and crash through very quickly. But I would expect, as I said, to see some of the stuff that didn't make it through wash up, but we know that they were committed to featuring.
Jen, I imagine in the real world, beyond the Westminster bubble, people won't be paying all that much attention to a fiscal responsibility lock act being brought forward. What are the things that you think people who've just been to the polls, people who've clocked we've got a new government, will most notice, which might be coming up in the legislative programme in the first term?
Well, I think, I mean, certainly my experience of the election was that it was the most disengaged election that I've covered, and I think that was reflected in turnout. Apparently, I was listening to something last night that was saying that actually, shouldn't really say this as a journalist, but that news articles and broadcast and coverage in general of the election was also down. So I think that kind of reflects that people were not very enthusiastic about the election itself and have probably gone away to think about other things now. I think always this stuff does come down to how much money people feel as though they have in their pockets. So, quite what it was that Rachel Reeves was laying the ground for in her speech earlier this week, my kind of instinctive feeling was that it was more likely to be spending restraint actually than anything else. Will people notice that? I think Labour, I'm not sure necessarily actually that Labour voters quite knew from the conversations that I've had, or quite clocked that actually not only are the spending taps not going to be turned on, but we could actually see some fairly kind of difficult spending periods beyond what we've already had for public services. So I suspect that if there was anything in that space that kind of emerges, I think that will probably be noticed, right? I think the renters reform stuff around no-fault evictions, although people won't be looking out for a renters reform bill going through the Commons, I think that really will have a very big tangible impact on the ground, and that has been promised for a really long time, and it got lost in the wash-up again. So I do think that is something that will make a significant difference, even if the actual legislation is not necessarily kind of immediately noticed. I don't think everybody's going to be tuning in to watch the King's speech.
Notice you tweeted recently, Jen, that about this point you've just made about the lack of enthusiasm for politics and the ability of politics to deliver change. And if you make these promises to people and then don't deliver, then of course they believe that politicians will deliver. Do you get a sense that Labour is trying to just set lower expectations that it can meet? Is that a good strategy? If so, or if that's not what they're doing, is that what they should be doing?
I don't know whether they are necessarily setting lower expectations. I mean, they want to be the fastest growing, the fastest sustained economic growth in the G7 or whatever. I don't think that that's a particularly lower expectation, actually. I think that they are very aware that they haven't got much time in which to demonstrate delivery. I think they know that, and I think that's kind of, that is one of the reasons that we've seen them straight out the traps on planning, because it doesn't cost money, and they do want to be able to show fairly quickly that houses are being built, and they do know that people are bothered about that, notwithstanding the fact that you've also got the NIMBY problem. It's going to be politically difficult. But I think it looks to me as though they're trying to prioritise the things that give them a bit of a chance to demonstrate some change in a short space of time. So I think they are live to that. I think the bigger question is whether or not it's possible, particularly in the financial circumstances that we've got.
Emma, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just on the King's Speech, I think this is probably another instance where we're going to see that balance between kind of, chunky long-term things and things that feel like they're going to make a difference now. I think, exactly as Jo said, we want to see a clear statement of kind of big priorities. That's what we set out in our Centre Commission report. But I think there's kind of, what does that then look like in practice? We're probably going to see something on rail in there and renationalisation. Obviously, that's a kind of lengthy project, but I do think that's going to be quite an important signal if we're thinking about some of the things people experience day to day. Jen, I'm thinking of some of your articles in the FT magazine I've read recently. Sorting out rail would have a pretty big impact on people's lives. I think also there's going to be an opportunity to kind of translate some of the goal around safer streets into what that looks like in practice. I think we're probably going to see something in there on knife crime and what Labour's approach to kind of tackling that might look like. And then I think there's some kind of interesting questions around how Starmer might develop his idea of kind of politics of service in the King's Speech. He's obviously, there's a question about whether he's going to put Martin's law in through the King's Speech. This is the law that the legislation that's been proposed by Martin Hett's mother. Martin Hett was killed in the Manchester Arena bombing. He has made a commitment to do that, but hasn't necessarily committed to that happening in the King's Speech. So I think this will be, an interesting opportunity to actually deliver on some of those kind of promises that have been made to people as well. So I think it'll be really interesting to see that trade between, kind of big picture, long-term legislation and things that are actually going to result in change quite quickly.
Just before I come back to you, Jen, picking up on that last point you made there, Emma, we've got an anonymous question asking what might work to improve standards in public life look like. What do you think is actually going to, as you say, pick up on that sort of politics of service type point? And specifically saying, do you think we might see any changes to the public appointments processes?
I think really good question. I mean, I think this new government have already gone really big on the idea of trust. They clearly understand that there is a big gap between where the kind of public is and where government wants it to be on believing that government can be a positive force in people's lives. I think that they're going to go really big, therefore, on delivery. I think that's why we've seen such stability in the kind of cabinet appointments process. They want to give people doing the big jobs the best opportunity to get on with them. I think that's also why we're seeing expertise brought in on areas that they want to make real progress on. So I think, Labour's attempt to kind of rebuild that trust is going to be focused around delivery and actually getting things done.
Jen, coming back to you.
Oh yeah, it was just a quick one about rail. Actually, I do think if there's some rail nationalisation in the King's Speech, I think that will be noticed. I have a bit of a theory about rail nationalisation, which I don't think that in the long run that it's necessarily about whether it's nationalised or privatised in terms of public opinion. It's just simply that the system that we've got has been so broken for such a long time that if you say to people, shall we nationalise it these days, they will just go, yes. But, if you go back in time to British Rail, I don't know whether that necessarily the same conversation would have been, might have been the case in reverse. I think that the thing with nationalising the railways, although that is kind of like sort of at face value quite popular, the way that Labour, I think I'm right in saying, have structured it is they're doing it according to when the franchises run out. So some of that stuff won't happen quickly. And actually, arguably, we are already in a situation where fundamentally the industry is nationalised anyway. So that doesn't kind of get you out of the difficulty of the rewiring and the relationships with the unions. And that's the tough bit, right? That's the bit that's going to actually lead to improvements for people on the ground. I think it kind of, although I'm sure the kind of the premise of kind of public control over things might be popular, if and when that occurs, it won't be sufficient. The difficult bit will be the bit that people needs to happen in order for people to see it.
I thought it was quite amusing to see some of those new MPs making the journey from their constituency to Westminster and discovering the problems with the rail network along the way. Emma, how much pressure do you think the Labour government is under to deliver quickly, what are the kind of factors which are driving their approach to what they can do in the long term? We've got some questions coming in about, is it going to be a multi-year spending review? Is it going to be the sort of longer term, sort of more strategic approach? Or do you get the sense that actually some of this stuff has to be done fast, and so that they won't feel they have time for that?
I mean, I think it's going to be both. I think we've just been talking about trust. And I think given how big Labour have gone in opposition and in the early days of government on kind of big, chunky, long-term reform, pitching things that are going to take multiple terms, I can't see them stepping away from that. And that's exactly why here at IFG we are making the case for instance, kind of multi-year spending reviews that don't just allocate money to on a kind of siloed departmental basis, but properly fund real cross-cutting reform. So I think that is definitely going to be part of the mix. But of course, Labour's under massive pressure to deliver in the context of living standards, as I was talking about, in the context of the state of public services. I think also Labour have been looking for some time now at the US and trying to understand what has kind of happened with Biden. He introduced a series of really quite progressive pro-growth policies like the $500 billion green energy strategy, and yet that doesn't seem to be kind of connecting with voter satisfaction in the way that you might expect. And my sense is that the lesson that some of the kind of people working in Labour strategy are taking from that is that big kind of long-term growth-driven policies might deliver the goods over the long term, but people want to see tangible day-to-day changes in their lives too. They want to know how politicians are improving their lives today as well as in the long term, particularly when they can't afford the basics, particularly when they can't, drive down roads without bursting tyres and so on. And so I think there is inevitably going to be enormous pressure to combine that long-termism with making changes now. I do think they'll probably also feel a bit of additional pressure from the reform vote. Reform what came second in more than 100 seats, 89 of them were Labour. So I think that also puts pressure on issues like immigration and crime. There's the potential for those to be driven a bit rightwards, and I think Labour will want to kind of show that they're acting quite quickly on some of those issues, hence probably seeing border security force in the King's Speech and probably early action on street crime in the King's Speech.
That's really interesting. I mean, I think for me, I guess the ultimate question for Labour is whether what it is even possible to deliver in a 5-year term in these circumstances is enough to satisfy, will ever be enough to satisfy the public. Even if everything went right and they did everything right from this point from which they're starting, could that be enough? Joe, just to go back to the King's Speech and link back into the question of emissions and so on, what are the political priorities that Labour might want to focus on now, which aren't in emissions and which sort of are nonetheless important?
Yeah, so I mean, we've touched on a few of them around standards and rails and some of the rail and even some of the stuff Emma was talking about on potholes. It's probably three I would point to. Defence. I know things feel disproportionately defensy this week because of NATO, but I do think they will continue with quite a big focus on defence. It was quite a big part of the narrative, and in the manifesto they sort of have their 5 missions, but also some of the, I can't remember what they call them, is it foundations that kind of sit across them, and defence was one of those. The second, Emma mentioned immigration. I think they will probably know that's one of the areas they had a less complete answer to in the election in terms of what it is they're going to do. I think that is both in terms of small boats, but also to do with the economic migration question, where I imagine in these imaginary mission boards that includes people from business that we've sort of been talking about, there will be quite a few people from industry that sit down and say, one of the things I really need is help with skills and labour. And they will have some demands on the immigration system. And Labour will need to square the circle with wanting to drive down the overall numbers of net migration with some of the demands from industry for skills and workers in some of the particular sectors, construction, where they want to build a lot of houses and some infrastructure projects, they will, I'm sure, be met with calls for more people. And so that is going to be an area that they're going to have to juggle. And then the third and final thing I was going to point to, which is maybe a cop-out because it's quite catch-all-y, and that's just the inheritance, where I think there will be lots of things like sewage, prisons, they're going to have to fix very quickly. And I think they will also, from a political perspective, want to start to shape a narrative about the inheritance that helps them with exactly what you were saying, Hannah, which is how do they manage expectation for the change that they're able to deliver? And one of the ways is by talking very publicly in quite detailed terms about exactly what the state of the inheritance was that they gathered. So I think there will be some specific inheritance problems they'll have to deal with, but I think whether it's through Reeves's statement, there's been talk of reviews into things like the NHS and the current state of it. We'll just start to see more of these things that will be about framing the inheritance as much as identifying the long list of problems that they're going to need to fix.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can fit in a couple more questions from the audience before we have to finish at 2 o'clock. So Emma, one for you. How do you think the relationship between the government and the civil service will change under the new government? I guess I could add, should it change?
Well, I think it's really interesting to see some of the early signalling from the incoming government. Starmer chose to make it a priority in his first days in office to record a direct message to the civil service, kind of resetting the relationship between the two. You know, it's no secret that the relationship between the civil service and the former Conservative government had been really quite fraught at points and wasn't in a great place in some areas. And so Labour are clearly wanting to kind of acknowledge that, signal their respect and try and get things off on a new foot. So I think there's a real kind of opportunity there. I think there are, in the context of missions, kind of questions about how the civil service is working, how you can encourage it to operate in a more cross-cutting way, how, you know, kind of core civil service processes like the spending review can be changed. I think there is also inevitably, when you have a new government kind of come into office, questions about other things that need to be refreshed. You know, civil servants have been speaking the language of Conservative governments for 14 years now. So there's the soft stuff around how do they ensure they're talking in a way which feels kind of consistent with the signals that a Labour government wants to give their priorities. And I know the civil service will have been thinking hard about that. I think there's also a question about the kind of networks that the civil service kind of holds and leans on. And I think that, you know, you would expect under a Labour government, for instance, for them to potentially want to reach out to civil society, perhaps more than the previous Conservative government did. So I think there's a kind of question of relationships too, on what kind of networks they might want to kind of rebuild and reach on that perhaps they didn't so much under the previous government.
And that's very much the focus also of this missions-based approach, isn't it? That sort of bringing everyone into the tent to try to deliver. Okay, there's a final question which I'm going to ask you all to answer, and I'm going to add my second half to it. It's an anonymous question, which is, what is the most significant obstacle a new minister will face when implementing their manifesto commitments? But I'm going to give you also the option of giving me an opportunity that new ministers coming into government in this context have to potentially do things differently. So biggest obstacles, sort of generally speaking, for new ministers coming in at this point in the parliamentary cycle, and biggest opportunities. Who would like to go first? Not Jen. Joe.
Thanks so much. I will start with the opportunity, where I think they will just find lots of energy behind what they want to do. And I mean that largely in particular in outside of government, who will have seen a big majority and it looked like, you know, new management installed for what could be a decade. And so lots of the stakeholders that might have, you know, 6 weeks ago said to government, oh, I'm not sure that's a good idea, I'm not sure we're like, there are these problems with it, they will enter those meetings and think, how can we best help you? We want to be as helpful as we possibly can to people who look like they might be in power for quite a long time based on the results. So I think they will find energy that potentially the same conversations with the same cast list, but just with a different political party sitting as the minister, will just go quite differently to how they will have gone 6 weeks ago or so. One of the biggest challenges, I think it's just time. And I mean that in like two senses. The relatively short amount of time that they have got to work out exactly what it is they want to do and actually do it so that it feels different for people and voters ahead of the next election. But also the vanishingly tight amount of time that they'll have in their own personal diaries, with everyone wanting a slice of them and everyone wanting to present them with their problem to try and fix. And I think it will be very easy for them to be pulled in a million different directions that feels like they've done lots, but can't point to one big thing that they've done over the next, say, 100 days or so.
Very good. Emma, 30 seconds, one or the other, an opportunity or a challenge?
On opportunity, I think the mandate, it just feels like they have a huge mandate to actually make progress on some issues that have been big sticking points politically before. And I completely agree with Jo. It feels like there's an energy there, not just inside government, but outside government, to get on with it. And it's hard to overemphasize how important that is to getting over some big barriers. I think, look, the challenge is money. Take the NHS, you know, there are a whole host of things you can do that actually just involve spending your existing money more effectively, whether that's on workforce or infrastructure. But that only gets you so far. To really achieve transformative change, there's going to need to be additional funding too.
Thanks, Emma. Jen, you get the final word.
Well, I mean, I would have said everything, all of the above. So I will, two things on obstacles. I think actually figuring out how things get delivered on the ground, I think, is a lot harder than it looks. And, you know, you don't get in there and have the ability to just push a button and things happen out there. That's hard. I also think that their own colleagues could end up being an obstacle, you know, relatively quickly, given that most of the Commons will be Labour, and you know, so a lot of people, a very wide voter coalition that they're going to need to attempt to keep together. But the opportunity is the level of goodwill out there, particularly among business. I think that there will be a lot of people external to the government who kind of want to get things done.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much to Jo Owen, Emma Norris and Jen Williams in particular for joining us today. I think that's been a really fascinating gallop through some of the early signs that we can see from this new Labour government and how it's going to govern. Do stick with the OFG as we continue to track the emerging shape of the new government and start to see what it has in mind in terms of policy and approach. You can always go to our website and follow our weekly podcasts to hear what the latest developments are. So thanks everyone for joining us today.